No gunshots, no declaration of war. Yet in the Arctic, a silent strike is quietly melting away one of America's levers of power. All it took was an old railway line, an abandoned port, and a decision Washington couldn't stop. When Canada opened the gates of Hudson Bay, hundreds of billions of dollars in agricultural goods began flowing out of the U.S. system, without confrontation, without retaliation, simply by choosing their own path. If you want to understand how power works in the 21st century, not through bombs and bullets, but through infrastructure, logistics, and calculated silence, stay with us until the end of this video. And if you value deep, deliberate geopolitical analysis that cuts to the core of global shifts, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the stories quietly reshaping the world, even when they unfold in silence. Why should we send Canadian fertilizer through USB ports when we have our own gateway to Europe? That question echoed through a hall full of Saskatchewan farmers in March 2025, and for a moment time seemed to freeze. Not because the idea was new, but because it was right. So simple, so obvious. It made people realize, for decades, Canada had grown used to a kind of absurdity it never truly named. Mark Carney wasn't there to argue. He was there to end a way of thinking. Once the question was asked, it was no longer a question. It became a declaration. For years, Canadian agriculture functioned like a massive machine trapped in a single corridor. Wheat from Saskatchewan, canola from Alberta, potash from deep underground mines, all of it had to move south, flowing through American railroads, American ports, American logistics companies before it could reach the global market. It wasn't the most efficient route, but it was the familiar one. And in politics, as in economics, familiarity is often more dangerous than weakness because it lulls strategic thinking to sleep. That system endured until it became political. When Donald Trump began talking about 25% tariffs on Canadian crops, about fertilizer fees, about using trade as a tool of pressure, the veil of dependency was instantly torn away. Suddenly, what once looked like neutral infrastructure revealed its true nature, a mechanism of power. Invisible roots took on the shape of levers, and Canada realized, when the livelihoods of millions of farmers depend on political decisions made elsewhere, that's no longer trade, that's a strategic risk. In that moment, Ottawa was forced to look back at the map, not a map of alliances, not a map of ideologies, but a map of pure geography. And on that map, a long-forgotten name stood out with surprising clarity: Churchill, a deepwater Arctic port, once neglected, once sold off cheap, once written off as a historical mistake. But in a world where political pressure seeps into every shipping container, Churchill suddenly became an escape route, a gateway that needs no one's permission to open. And from the moment that question became a declaration, a deeper truth began to emerge. To understand how Canada could do this, and why it makes Washington uneasy, we have to return to something few talk about, but which forms the foundation of it all. Canada isn't just a farming nation. Canada is a true agricultural superpower. They just hadn't acted like one, until now. To call Canada a major agricultural nation would still be an understatement. The truth is, Canada operates as a silent pillar of global food security, a weight the world benefits from every day, yet rarely calls by its rightful name. There are no sweeping farmland vistas like in American Midwest movies, no political slogans proclaiming farmers are the soul of the nation. Canada stepped into this role quietly, almost accidentally, and that very quietness has led its strength to be underestimated, even by Canadians themselves. Beneath the soil of Saskatchewan lie vast potash reserves, enough to sustain global agriculture for generations. Above ground, fields of high-protein wheat, among the finest in the world, feed European bakeries and demanding Asian markets that rely on it almost entirely. Alberta's canola wins its way through the global edible oil supply chain. Lentils, peas, and oats from Canada show up on healthy menus from Berlin to Tokyo. Many nations can grow crops, but very few can deliver them with Canada's consistency, quality, scale, and resilience. The issue has never been production capacity. The issue is control. For decades, Canada acted like an agricultural superpower, renting someone else's roads. They produced, but others controlled the exits. Crops from Western Canada had to navigate familiar choke points, an overburdened Vancouver. Eastern routes that were too distant and too slow. And the easiest way was always through the United States. Each shipment carried more than just transport costs, it carried an invisible dependency. When things were stable, that dependency was treated as a logistical footnote, but when politics stirred, it instantly became a vulnerability. And the remarkable thing is, Canada was never short on geographic options. What it lacked was strategic thinking. For far too long, Canadian agriculture was built on a quiet assumption that the US would always be a stable partner, that American infrastructure was neutral, that trade would forever remain above politics. That assumption once held true until it didn't. When tariff threats surfaced, when fertilizer fees were placed on the negotiating table, Canada realized an agricultural superpower that doesn't control its own export routes is just a vulnerable supplier. That moment of realization exposed a bitter paradox. Canada had everything it needed to control its agricultural supply chain, except a decisive choice in the past. It had the resources. It had the markets. It had the global demand behind it. What it lacked was a truly independent gateway, one that could turn productive strength into strategic power. And when Ottawa began searching for a solution to that equation, it didn't need to invent anything new. It just needed to look back, northward, to a port built with precisely that ambition in mind, and then forgotten for nearly a century. There, in the frozen grip of Hudson Bay, lies a name once written off as a historical mistake. A deep water port, a rail line cut through harsh lands, an old dream buried under short-term thinking and a lack of patience. As Canada began to call its agricultural power by its true name, it was also forced to confront the next, harder question. Was this abandoned asset proof of failure, or a sleeping giant waiting for its moment to wake up? Churchill was never a name meant to symbolize failure. On the contrary, when this port was built back in the 1930s, it carried a distinctly Canadian ambition: to break free from dependency, to open a direct gateway to the world, and to allow crops from the prairie heartland to reach global markets without winding through intermediaries. Geographically, Churchill is nearly perfect. Hudson Bay offers the shortest sea route from the center of North America to Europe. A rail line stretching over 1,000 kilometers connects the agricultural heartland to the sea. On the map, it's an obvious advantage, but history doesn't move by the logic of maps. It moves by political will. And Churchill became the victim of a generational lack of patience. Seasonal operations, high maintenance costs, and slow-to-arrive profits, all of these turned this Arctic port into a perpetual low priority. While southern routes received steady investment, Churchill was gradually pushed to the margins, existing more as a relic of an unfinished dream than a component of national strategy. The height of that neglect came in 1997, when the port and rail line were sold to a U.S. company for a symbolic price of $1. That number didn't reflect Churchill's true value. It reflected the depth of short-term thinking. As long as the burden was offloaded, its future was no longer a pressing concern. Under new ownership, Churchill saw little real investment. It survived in limbo, waiting, slowly slipping out of Canada's strategic consciousness. When a flood in 2017 destroyed the railway, the port's only artery to the rest of the country, the response wasn't rescue, but retreat. Churchill was cut off. This Arctic town suddenly became an abandoned island within Canada's own territory. For many, it marked the end. Another piece of evidence that the Arctic dream had never been realistic. But it was at the lowest point of that despair that something unexpected happened. Not Ottawa, not a major corporation, but First Nations communities and local groups in northern Manitoba stepped in to buy back the port and the rail line. They didn't give grand geopolitical speeches. They simply held one quiet belief: Churchill still had value. When Arctic Gateway Group was formed, most observers dismissed it as a symbolic move, driven more by emotion than strategy. Few believed a coalition of local actors could revive infrastructure that even the federal government had walked away from. For years, that skepticism seemed justified. Churchill remained quiet, operating minimally, waiting for a world that would finally match its value. And then that world appeared, not through melting ice or new shipping lanes, but through politics. As global trade began to be weaponized, as familiar shipping routes grew politically risky, Churchill, once a problem, suddenly became a solution. What had once seemed inconvenient, remote, harsh, hard to maintain, now offered a rare advantage. It lay beyond the reach of traditional levers of control. Suddenly, the question was no longer, why are we keeping Churchill? It became, why did we ever abandon it for so long? But no awakening happens without a force strong enough to break old inertia. Churchill might have stayed asleep for years more, if not for an external shock that jolted Canada out of its comfort zone. And that shock, ironically, didn't come from the Arctic. It came from Washington, from the tariff threats and trade pressure of a U.S. president who had no intention of reviving a Canadian port, but who ended up being the very reason Ottawa had to wake up. Donald Trump wasn't the first to make Canada uneasy about its trade relationship with the U.S., but he was the first to do it so bluntly, openly, and without any attempt to conceal his intent. When the announcements came about a 25% tariff on Canadian agricultural goods, when fertilizer, once thought to be a purely technical issue, was dragged onto the political bargaining table, Ottawa could no longer reassure itself that this was just a temporary turbulence. The way Trump spoke, the way he threatened, and more importantly, the way he was willing to turn trade infrastructure into a tool of coercion, exposed a truth Canada had long avoided. Dependency is only safe when the other side chooses not to use it. From Washington's point of view, Trump's logic was simple. The U.S. is the gateway. If you want to pass through, you accept the terms. No matter how strong Canadian agriculture might be, it still had to move through U.S. ports, U.S. railroads, U.S. logistics firms. In that system, power didn't belong to the producer. It belonged to the gatekeeper. Trump didn't need to shut the door entirely. He only had to suggest he might. And the entire supply chain trembled. And that tremble was the real message. But what Trump likely didn't anticipate was Canada's strategic psychological response. Instead of fear or concession, his threats stirred something else, a sense of insult. Not economic insult, but an insult to sovereignty. A nation with resources, land, technology, and access to global markets still had to worry about a single transit route across a border. That was the moment Ottawa had to ask the most uncomfortable question. If today it's tariffs, what will it be tomorrow? And how long until a partner becomes a critical choke point? Mark Carney and others of his generation saw it clearly. They understood. You cannot build economic security on the permanent goodwill of anyone. Trump didn't create the problem. He exposed it. And in geopolitics, moments of exposure are more dangerous than direct conflict because they force action. Canada began reassessing its entire agricultural chain, not to fine-tune costs, but to answer a fundamental question. Where does the power to decide actually lie? Once that question was on the table, Churchill was no longer a symbolic choice. It became part of a survival equation, but governments alone couldn't carry it. A strategy only becomes real when business believes in it, when someone is willing to put real money on the table. And that's when a critical signal appeared. Not from Ottawa, not from Washington, but from Saskatchewan, where the people who understood better than anyone the value of fertilizer and the price of dependence decided to fire the first shot. If politics creates the momentum, it's business that transforms that momentum into concrete action. And in the story of Churchill, Genesis Fertilizers marked the moment when all the doubt began to fade. Not through policy declarations, not through sovereignty slogans, but through numbers, contracts, and irreversible investment decisions. When Genesis announced plans to build a large-scale nitrogen fertilizer plant in Saskatchewan, many dismissed it as just another industrial project in the prairies. But once the logistics route was revealed, the entire picture shifted. Genesis didn't choose the familiar path. They didn't move raw materials through the U.S. They didn't export through U.S. ports. They chose Churchill. A decision that through the old lens might have seemed bold, maybe even reckless. But through the lens of a global company that lives on margin and long-term stability, it was a move that was coldly rational. Import phosphate and ammonium sulfate directly via Hudson Bay, produce on-site in Western Canada, export fertilizer straight to European markets. The entire value chain contained within a zone Genesis could fully control. The key wasn't the 1 million tons of fertilizer per year. The key was the message behind that number. U.S. infrastructure is no longer a requirement. Genesis was proving that the economics had shifted. Shorter transport routes, lower political risk, higher predictability. In an industry where even small logistical disruptions can erode margins, control is sometimes more valuable than subsidies or tax breaks. And Genesis didn't act out of patriotic sentiment or knee-jerk reaction to Trump. They acted out of a very practical truth. If your entire supply chain can be thrown into question by a political decision beyond your borders, it's not a resilient supply chain. And when a company is willing to invest hundreds of millions into a new direction, they're not thinking about a single presidential term. They're placing a bet on an entire decade. The moment Genesis made that announcement, Churchill was no longer a story of what if. It became a story of what is. Banks began to take notice, logistics companies started recalculating, policymakers realized this was no longer a pilot project. This was a signal that the private sector was ready to restructure around a new axis. And in political economy, there's no confirmation more powerful than when real capital starts to move. But Genesis is just the beginning. Fertilizer is foundational. It quietly determines the yield of every field. But it's not the whole picture. Once a logistics corridor proves itself viable for fertilizer, the next question becomes inevitable. What happens when larger, heavier, and more symbolic cargo starts to follow that path? What happens when it's not just chemical plants, but fields of wheat, canola, and oats that begin to look to Hudson Bay as their natural outlet? At that point, Churchill stops being the choice of a single company. It becomes the choice of an entire ecosystem. And from fertilizer, the quiet starting point, the story inevitably slides toward grain. A shift quiet in its arrival, but big enough to tilt the balance of all North American agriculture. If fertilizer is the quiet foundation of agriculture, then grain is its public face, the most visible expression of food power. And it's precisely here that Churchill's growing role begins to reveal its full strategic weight. No loud press releases, no fiery political declarations, just closed-door meetings between cooperatives, exporters, and logistics firms, where one question keeps coming up, with growing seriousness. If fertilizer can move through Churchill, why not wheat? For decades, Vancouver has been the artery of Canada's grain exports, a massive modern port, but constantly stretched to its limits. Every strike, every rail delay, every weather shock ripples like a fever through the entire supply chain. Prairie farmers have grown used to that helpless feeling. You finish production and then you wait. Wait for rail cars, wait for berth space, wait for a system you don't control. Churchill is not being seen as a replacement for Vancouver, but as a pressure valve. A second route, one different enough to break the bottleneck. What makes Churchill attractive for grain isn't glamour, it's geometry. The route through Hudson Bay is days shorter than the long swing down to the Pacific coast and across canals or straits. 6 days at sea isn't just 6 days of cost, it's 6 days of risk. 6 days of freed up working capital, 6 days that can make the difference in tight bidding wars against Russia, Ukraine, or Australia. In global grain trade, where margins are razor thin and volume is king, time is money. But there's something even more important than time: silence. Not the silence of secrecy, but the silence of not needing permission. When a grain shipment leaves Hudson Bay, it doesn't cross U.S. territory, doesn't rely on U.S. ports, and isn't exposed to any political leverage from Washington. For exporters, that's a kind of strategic insurance, not written into contracts, not immediately quantifiable, but immensely valuable in a world where trade is increasingly drawn into power struggles. That's why the upgrades to Churchill are no longer experimental. Storage capacity is expanding, loading systems are being modernized, rail capabilities are being recalculated, not for a few 100,000 tons, but for millions. These numbers haven't yet made splashy headlines, but they're already showing up in investment spreadsheets. And when those spreadsheets start to align, the shift becomes irreversible. What's remarkable is how quietly this change is unfolding. There's no Churchill revolution, no historic declaration day, just shipment after shipment, small at first, then larger, trial contracts, then repeat orders, individual business decisions quietly stacking into a collective shift. And it's that quietness that makes it most threatening to the old order, because by the time anyone notices, the supply chain has already begun to reroute. At that point, the story is no longer about a port or even a few million tons of grain. It starts to touch numbers that are bigger, heavier, and far more politically charged. When enough cargo streams converge, when enough private decisions all point in the same direction, the value of that movement can't be measured in individual contracts anymore. It has to be seen at the system level, where trade, power, and decision-making intersect. And that's when one number begins to appear on every analyst's desk, not as a revenue forecast, but as a measure of a shifting world order: $780 billion. $780 billion wasn't a number designed to shock. It emerged quietly, buried in dense analysis, in 10 or 20-year projections where experts speak not of emotion or politics, but of the movement of goods. And that's exactly what makes it so daunting. It doesn't represent a single deal, a flashy project, or a record harvest. It represents decision-making power. Who controls the exit routes for Canadian agriculture in the decades to come? When you add up Saskatchewan's potash, prairie grain, fertilizer, and the many other related goods, the trade volume that could flow through Churchill over a long economic cycle is no longer some distant hypothetical. Every ton that reroutes doesn't just carry money, it carries a choice pulled away from someone else's hands. Under the old order, most of those choices rested south of the border. Under the new one, they're gradually shifting back to Ottawa, to Saskatchewan, to Alberta, the places that actually produce and bear the risks. What gives the $780 billion figure its geopolitical weight isn't just its size, it's its accumulation. Supply chains don't shift overnight, but once they do, they create massive inertia. Railways get upgraded, storage facilities are built, long-term contracts are signed, companies restructure their business models around the new route. Each small step makes turning back more costly. And eventually, the question of should we go back stops being asked altogether. From Washington's point of view, this isn't a sudden shock. It's more like slow-motion ice melt. There's no moment of collapse, just the steady sensation of power slipping away. Trump could roll back tariffs, he could change his tone, he could try to repair relationships, but what he can't do is unwind billions of dollars already committed by companies to an independent route. Leverage only exists when the other side still needs you. Once they don't, it simply disappears. For Canada, the $780 billion is also a test of character. It raises a hard question. Does the country have the patience and consistency to see through a long-term strategy? Because power doesn't come from opening a door. It comes from keeping it open long enough for the entire system to pass through. And it's at this point that the excitement begins to give way to harder, more uncomfortable questions. Because Churchill is no rose-paved road. Beneath the melting ice and the impressive projections, real risks remain. Tangible limits capable of derailing the entire ambition if underestimated. And if this time is going to be different, Canada must confront those risks head on. Not cover them with optimism, but stare them down with realism. Churchill is no miracle, and no one understands that better than Canada. Looking at maps and spreadsheets alone, it's easy to forget that this is an Arctic port, where nature doesn't negotiate and mistakes are not forgiven. Melting ice destabilizes the permafrost. The ground shifts centimeters at a time, enough to bend steel rails. Each brutal winter is a stress test for infrastructure, for engineering, for the ability to keep things running. A rail line stretching over 1,000 kilometers through sparsely populated terrain leaves no room for complacency. One failure point can paralyze the entire chain. And Churchill isn't an industrial hub waiting to be activated. It lacks workers, it lacks housing, it lacks basic support services. Every additional container of cargo means new homes must be built, new people must be brought in, and new investments must be made in things that don't show up on a quarterly profit report. And above all, the shipping season remains a hard limit. Without icebreakers, without tight coordination between the Navy and Coast Guard, ambition freezes in place. But this is where the difference begins to show. These risks are no longer being papered over with blind optimism. They're being calculated, costed, and confronted. No one in Ottawa believes anymore that Churchill will run itself once reopened. This time, there's real capital, not a trickle of public funds. There are real businesses involved, not demonstration projects. There is geopolitical momentum strong enough to keep attention focused, even when profits take time to appear. More importantly, this time, Canada isn't going it alone. Saskatchewan needs a way out for its crops. Alberta needs export diversification. Local communities need jobs and connection. Arctic Gateway is no longer just a symbolic name. It's the center of a web of overlapping interests where every stakeholder has something to lose if the project fails. And that mutual stake is what creates discipline, the one thing previous efforts lacked. Churchill is no longer a lonely Arctic dream. It's a test of strategic maturity. Canada knows this path is rough, expensive, and fraught with risk. But it also understands something else, something colder, clearer. The cost of going back to dependence is even higher. And it's that awareness, not melting ice or ice-breaking ships, that gives this story its best chance of reaching the end. There's a paradox in geopolitics that only becomes clear through experience. Powerful leverage rarely disappears because it's defeated. It disappears because it's no longer needed. Donald Trump believed trade pressure would force Canada to bend, to concede, to preserve the vital flow of agricultural exports. But what he didn't anticipate was that pressure would push Canada towards something far more fundamental, a decision to grow up. When a nation realizes that convenience has quietly become the anchor, keeping it in place, the moment it chooses to cut that anchor often arrives in silence. But the consequences last for decades. Churchill isn't just a port. It isn't just a rail line through frozen terrain. It's the symbol of a mental pivot. From accepting dependency as normal, Canada began to ask different questions about control, about sovereignty, about the true cost of convenience. Every ton of fertilizer leaving Hudson Bay isn't just a shipment. It's a silent declaration that political leverage has lost its bite. Every grain train heading north is a small but decisive step, pulling Canada further from a familiar sphere of influence. On the surface, $780 billion sounds like a story about money and trade. But deeper down, it's a story about choice. Who decides the exit routes of Canadian agriculture? Who holds veto power when politics flare? Once infrastructure is built, once companies have bet real capital, once supply chains have rerouted, those questions are no longer debated at negotiating tables. They're answered through daily operations. America's leverage didn't collapse in a dramatic moment. It melted, slowly, like Arctic ice under the weight of irreversible change. And once that ice melts, there's no command, no policy that can freeze it back into place. By opening its northern gate, Canada has quietly stepped off an old track without needing to declare confrontation. That's why the Churchill story isn't just for Canada. It's not just for the US. It's a reminder to every nation living within the safety of dependency. At some point, the cost of not choosing becomes greater than the cost of taking a risk. If you have thoughts on this turning point for Canada, leave them in the comments below. And if you want to keep exploring deeper stories about geopolitics, trade, and global power, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what's coming next.